was doing my first documentary back in 1997 when I was just naive enough to think I can get an interview with Steven Spielberg. We had a mutual friend involved, this woman, Janet, and she gets back to me and she's like, yeah, so Spielberg's definitely not going to meet with you, but he knows you're working on this UFO documentary. He thinks you should look into this landing case that happened in Africa at the school. And I said to myself at the time, and remind you guys that I was making a film on UFOs, and I dismissed it so quickly because I thought, there's no way that a mass landing with the sheer volume of eyewitness testimony at a school in broad daylight could happen and the whole world not know about it. So I just walked away from that story for about 10 years. 10 years later, I'm doing an event at the National Press Club with Leslie Kean, who was part of the article in the New York Times that came out in 2017. And she introduced me to this guy, Randall Nickerson. And she's like, oh, he's working on this landing case in Africa. Long story short, he's working on a film specifically on just that case. Dan Farah is producing it. And he said, I'm working on the case, and if you want to do something with me on it, a small piece, I could. So I got back into it. I licensed some of the footage that Dr. John Mack, the Harvard psychiatrist that came and interviewed the school children on camera within a week of it happening. He unfortunately looked the wrong way in London, got run down by a car and died. So I contacted the Institute with the help of Randall Nickerson. I licensed the archival footage. We tracked down the witnesses today. We flew them in from all different corners of the world, brought them together. A lot of them were standing right next to each other. There were roughly 100 kids in the playground, broad daylight, aerial school, Rua, Zimbabwe, 1994. And they got within some of them within arm's length of these beings, and brought these witnesses together for the first time in 20 years. And a lot of them hadn't even told their significant others, just because they said they were tired of having to defend this. And I myself didn't believe it when I first heard about it back in 1997. And that segment of the film is the most, in my opinion, is the most powerful segment, because
it's very compelling.
You've got all these children saying what they saw on camera after it happened, and then you see them 20 years later, and then we go to Africa and we meet with the headmistress, or she was a teacher at the time. We meet with other witnesses. We go to the landing site. We talk to people at the school. That case is absolutely, and it was witnessed by lots of other people in and around the area for several days before it chose a school to land.
But those kids, the way they were talking about it and the way they were drawing it, you're like, wow, it really does seem like something happened to them.
I know how credible that the testimony of the children is, because my partner, Rebecca, she's never had much of an interest in what I do, making documentaries on UFOs. I do other things as well, but when I was reviewing in the studio the archival interview of the children, she just dropped off a cup of coffee and she stopped and went, oh my God. Those children are not lying. This is the most amazing thing I've ever seen. Because look, I ask your audience to don't take it from me. Just suspend judgment for a moment and imagine, hypothetically, if a UFO or several UFOs landed at a school in broad daylight in Rua, Zimbabwe, Africa, and interacted telepathically with nearly 100 school children. Not all of them had telepathic, but seen the incident. How significant of a story would you give that?
Well, not only that, they had the same message.
Yes.
What the telepathic message was that technology is a real problem.
Yes.
And there's things that people are doing with technology that are going to ruin the earth.
Yes.
And they were trying to relay this to children, which is very strange.
Yes.
You know, I mean, maybe they just thought they were adults because they were the same size as the aliens. I mean, do you think they knew that they were children? Do you think they understood that it was a school? I mean, this is all speculation, right?
But no, I definitely had to ask myself, look, during the production of the film, Paula Harris actually turned me on to another landing case that happened in Australia in 1966 at a school. And this time there were roughly 300 witnesses that saw a disc land right outside a playground in Australia. And we went to Australia and investigated that case, went to the landing site, talked to eyewitness testimony, people that jumped the fence at the school playground and ran over to where this thing landed. And then we even interviewed a guy who snapped a photograph of a disc, a Polaroid, back in 1966, 2 days prior to the incident. So it's very probably that we have photographic evidence, we have eyewitness testimony, and for the first time we've got testimony from a science teacher. So why do these things land at schools? It seems like, and I'm just totally speculating here, but it seems like if I were going to do that, it seems like a pretty benign environment. We've had testimony from military guys that we take a fairly hostile position towards things that penetrate sensitive military installations. And, so maybe, I'm just saying maybe
It's safe.
Yeah, maybe it's safe.
Maybe
but
it's
we
safe
have to stop reacting to intrusions by UFOs as a threat. I mean, that's the whole thing behind this new task force. And as much as I respect, the task force, my colleagues and I want to cooperate with them to the extent that we can bring information or resources to what they do. But there is more. This should not be looked at specifically as a threat. I mean, with the phenomena that we observe, I mean, if they wanted to blow up those F-18s, they could do it, okay?
Believe it or not, I'm not into UFOs. I don't follow stories or,
Even after your experiences?
No, I'm fascinated with the technology, and it irks me like every night I go to sleep that, that it was my own doing, essentially, that prevented me from continuing on in the project. I mean, it's that to be on that cutting edge of technology is so alluring to me.
Right.
But by the same token, I don't really care that there's aliens or where they come from. I mean, the prize is the technology, and that's what I'm fascinated by. But so I don't listen to UFO stories and that sort of thing. But George Knapp is, he's the guy that has the contacts and tries to thread everything together. And what he recently told me is he found, I don't know, it was either documentation or people that he spoke to. It's that the existence of this project, the project that I was on, it's something that they seem to take out every 8 or 10 years.
Admiral Wilson met with a scientist who's actually was featured in one of my films. Everybody has been debating whether or not this document is a real document. It's an actual conversation that happened, and this document is real. Everybody wants to know. The world is going crazy right now in the UFO world. I'll tell you straight up right now, I'm in the position to know, and it is a real document, that it is real. So the conversation you read in that conversation was had. I can't attest to every...
You're not being very clear.
Sure.
Please.
No problem. So there was a document that is circulating right now that is really big. It's going around everywhere. People are asking and
What is this document?
It's called the Wilson Memo, is how you can find it online, or the Wilson Leak. So Admiral Wilson meets with this scientist, and they have this discussion, oddly enough, at special projects at EG&G. And if I remember, the document is from 2001. The document comes out. They meet at EG&G special projects. In 1989, they stumble into a problem. This happens. They put the technology away, and then they bring it back out and see if material science has caught up and if they can make any progress. So this document kind of talks about this process. The big thing I get from it, and a lot of it's vindicating to Bob, and one of the things it's vindicating besides the EG&G thing, is that private industry, so this guy's an admiral, and he says, I found out about your SAP, your Special Access Program. I need to know about it. And he's going to a private part of industry, and he is denied access. And he says, I should be running this program. And they were able to deny him access. So I think the takeaway here is, check it out. I'm telling you that is an actual correct, that is a leak. Now, everything said in that document, I don't know.
What are you talking about? What is said in that document specifically?
It's between a scientist and an admiral that are sitting, and they're having a meeting, and they're talking about the search for the UFO subject, the search to get Special Access Program access to all of these different things like reverse engineering programs. So in this document, they talk about it. I believe that this document, the person that went was employed by Robert Bigelow, one of the guys that has a couple of orbiting satellites and all that stuff.
He's the guy who owns Skinwalker Ranch.
No, he's not.
No?
He was the guy that owns
He used
Skinwalker.
to own it. Okay.
Yeah, he used to own it. There's a new owner, and I interviewed him for my other film, but there's a new owner, and you'll be hearing a lot more about that soon. But there's stuff that you'll be hearing about Skinwalker Ranch soon because there's a new owner. Anyway, the whole point of this insertion here is just that document kind of validates a lot of this idea Bob just said, that they make a little progress, then they can't go anywhere. They tuck it away, and then they bring it back out, 10 years later and start working on it. What is the limiting factor? I think Bob should speak on this, but it's the material science.
Yeah, it's really where physics is. So I can see them doing that. I mean, I didn't have any information on that, but I think what George uncovered is probably accurate. That we try and do what we can, and once we reach a roadblock, going, we really can't figure it out. It's just friggin' put the thing away, wait for science to catch up, and a decade later, let's take the project out again and see, all right, now where can we go?
It used to be that one person would see something in the sky and say, look, Martha, look, there's something up there. Now things have changed. Now we have multiple sightings by multiple modes. That is the gold standard for looking for these objects. Not just one person, but several people that are reputable. Not just radar, but visual sighting, infrared sensors, telescopic evidence. Now we have multiple sightings by multiple modes. And so the burden of proof has shifted. It used to be the burden of proof was on the people who believed in UFOs. They saw something, prove it. Now the burden of proof has shifted to the Pentagon, to the military. Now they have to prove that these aren't extraterrestrial. And so I think there's been a sea change in the last just several years. 50 years ago, there was a congressional hearing, and it was coming out of Project Blue Book. And there was a lot of laughter and a lot of jokes about little green men in outer space. 50 years ago, that's the way it was. Now, things have changed. Now people are looking at, are they a threat militarily? What kinds of sensors do we have? What kind of metrics do we have? We now have, frame by frame, an analysis of these objects. These objects travel between Mach 5 and Mach 20. That's 20 times the speed of sound. These objects can zigzag, and we can measure the G-force inside this object. The G-forces are several hundred times the force of gravity. In other words, any living person's bones would be crushed by these objects, so they're probably drones of some sort. These objects can drop 70,000 feet in a few seconds. Think about that. It can drop a tremendous distance in just a few seconds, and they can go underwater. This is something that we didn't realize before, but yes, they can actually go underwater. And they also move without creating an exhaust or breaking the sound barrier. So these are things that we can now document frame by frame looking at these videotapes.
What was the shift? And how did you feel about UFOs, say like 10, 15 years ago?
I was skeptical. I said to myself, come on. I mean, 5 days you're going to look for flying saucers in the sky? They actually have photographic evidence of objects that can gyrate just the way the Pentagon has said. And so we now have a sea change. A center of gravity has changed with regards to looking at these objects.
What do you think is happening? Do you think that this is something that maybe another government from another country has created that far surpasses our abilities, or do you think that this is coming from somewhere else?
Well, the Pentagon has listed, I think, 5 different options. One option, of course, is that they're weather balloons or something that's an artifact of our space program. Maybe a piece of rocket that is plunging back into the Earth's atmosphere. That's one category. Another category is anomalous weather events. They happen, and they have to be looked at very carefully. But the last option is other. That is not just the Russians or the Chinese, because these objects apparently can gyrate faster than what the Chinese and the Russians can muster, but it opened the door to the possibility of other. They didn't specify what other was, but you can fill in the dots yourself. Now, one possibility for other is hypersonic drones. We see that in warfare now. The Russians, in the Battle of Ukraine, is actually using hypersonic drones to hit targets inside Ukraine. But you see, this is something just in the last few months. These sightings, they go back decades into the past, with objects executing these gyrations decades ago. And that's why you have to take them seriously.
Are there things that are classified that we are not going to have access to? Like, is it possible that, 18 years ago, they had the capability to have a vehicle or a drone move this way, that information has just not been released?
Well, 2 years ago, the United States military admitted that it stopped working on these hypersonic drones. Why? They're unstable. They zigzag. And that's why the Russians have put a premium on this technology to evade our Star Wars program. The Russians wanted a rocket that can maneuver and therefore outwit a stationary Star Wars system designed to shoot down these drones.
Right.
So that's why the Russians have put a priority on this, and they've now fielding it in warfare. We actually see them as a military weapon. 2 years ago, the United States military stopped its program. They're too unstable. They were not reliable, and it was not worth the amount of money to put into it because the military was invested in the Star Wars program, not the anti-Star Wars program. But because Vladimir Putin announced the hypersonic drones, then the United States military said, oops, nope, we have to get into the game too. So now the United States is also working on hypersonic drones as well as the Chinese. So the Chinese, the Russians, and the Americans are all working on these things. But you can see how primitive they are. We're talking about objects that defy the known laws of aerodynamics with a technology beyond what we have today. And so that's why people are scratching their heads. Whose are these things if they're not the Chinese, the Russians, or the United States? And then you can say that, no, it's an optical illusion. Well, we do that now. We have multiple sightings of these objects. By radar, we know how the velocity, the distance. Each time it comes out to be real. And so that's why we're scratching our heads. Who has this capability? And the answer is, we don't know.
From some other planet or some other galaxy or whatever, that something that maybe we have theorized that could be responsible for the way these things are able to move.
Well, when I talk to my friends who are physicists like myself about these things, they sort of laugh, giggle, their eyes roll up to the heavens, and they say something very simple, that a rocket using conventional means would take 70,000 years to reach us from the nearest star. Therefore, these objects cannot exist. 70,000 years for a Saturn rocket traveling at 25,000 miles per hour to go from a nearest star to the planet Earth. That's why most scientists disregard these sightings because they defy the laws of Einstein.
But isn't that kind of silly? Isn't that kind of like saying, you can't, how long it would take you to get a horse from Los Angeles to Sydney, Australia? Isn't that kind of like saying that?
Exactly. And that's why I say that assumes that these aliens or whatever are maybe 100 years more advanced than us. But open your mind to the possibility that they are 1,000 years more advanced than us. 1,000 years is nothing compared to the age of the universe.
Right.
The universe is about 13 billion plus years old. That's how the age of the universe. And so the age of a civilization, just a few thousand years ahead of us, that is just a blink of an eye to the universe itself. And once you go to higher energies, the laws of physics begin to break down. The laws of Einstein and the laws of the quantum theory break down at something called the Planck energy. Why is that important? That's what I do for a living. I work on something called string theory, which lives at the Planck energy. The Planck energy is 10 to the 19 billion electron volts. That is a quadrillion times more powerful than our most powerful atom smasher outside Geneva, Switzerland. Any civilization that could harness the Planck energy would be able to become masters of space and time. Space and time as we know it become unstable at the Planck energy, which is far beyond anything that we can muster here on the planet Earth. So we physicists theorize, how advanced do you have to be to access the Planck energy? Well, we rank them. The Kardashev scale says that there could be type 1, type 2, or type 3 civilizations. A type 1 civilization is maybe 100 years more advanced than us, to maybe 1,000 years, sort of like Buck Rogers or Flash Gordon. They control the weather. Volcanoes, earthquakes, anything planetary, they control. That's type 1. Then there's type 2. Type 2 is stellar. They harness the power of an entire star, like Star Trek. Star Trek would be a typical type 2 civilization where they manipulate entire stars. Then there's type 3. Type 3 is galactic. They roam the galactic space lanes. They play with black holes, like the Empire of the Star Wars series would be a typical type 3 civilization. Then the next question is, what type do you have to be to harness the Planck energy? The energy at which space and time become unstable, where wormholes may develop, gateways through space and time, portals through empty space. You have to be type 2 or most likely type 3. Then the next question is, how long will it take before you become type 3? Well, we are maybe 100 years away from being type 1. We're maybe a few thousand years from being type 2, and we're maybe 100,000 years from being type 3. And 100,000 years is nothing on a galactic scale. The age of the universe is, as I said, over 13 billion years old. And so once a civilization reaches the Planck energy, that is a type 3 civilization, space and time become your playground.
Let's take it back to the day that this happened. You're 22, you're logging, you're in the woods. Tell me what happened.
Well, it's just, when you're done working, hard physical labor, everybody's kind of jacked up, and there was a whole lot of chatter in the car. We're just talking away, it's starting to get dark. We just loaded up our equipment. We're headed out. And I looked up ahead, and I saw this kind of glow coming through the trees. First, I thought, no big deal. It was deer hunting season. Thought maybe there was some hunters camped up on the hill up there. Maybe light shining through a tent. It was still something really strange, kind of caught my eye. And one by one, the other guys in the crew started looking, but nobody said, "Oh my God, what's that?" or anything like that. It was just kind of an idle curiosity at first. But when we burst into the clearing where we could see the source of this glow, it was just, whoa, it was just mind-blowing instantly. I inexplicably got out of the truck and ran toward this thing. But I thought it was just going to take off, be gone in a flash. And
So when you say in the clearing, so are you driving on a dirt road?
yeah, it's a dirt road. Trees are real thick. This was a part of the contract we hadn't cut in yet, so trees were a lot thicker there, except for this clearing. And we weren't the only ones that saw it. We found out later. Sheriff had on file people who were in the area that saw it, hunters and fishermen over there at Black Canyon Lake. And the movement that they described was what the crew described when it left. A model of what he was describing. And that's actually the closest of any of the other descriptions I've seen. But I don't think these things have just one type of craft. I think there's many, many different shapes.
What makes you think that?
Well, personal experience. I try not to emphasize these other incidents, but I've seen the glowing sphere. I've seen the giant black triangle. Other craft that were a ball of light that you couldn't penetrate the light with your eyes. But
Now, this is after this experience.
I think the reason my brother Dwayne was persuaded more quickly than my brother Don was that he saw a craft in those woods. It was probably 10 miles from there while deer hunting. And it was kind of tic-tac shaped, and that's something that's been observed by, in military reports recently.
Yeah. So you see this thing, this disc-shaped craft,
Yeah.
and then what happens?
It started to move and started to get louder.
Louder.
Yeah. It was the guys in the truck heard it too. There was a low, thunderous kind of a rumble that you actually sort of felt more than heard. And then there were other high-pitched frequencies. Increase in volume, it suddenly got louder as it started to move. And, at the same time, the guys in the truck were screaming, "Get away from there, let's go, get back in the truck, let's go." And which would have been the smart thing to do. But as soon as it moved, it startled me, and I just ducked for cover. There was a log there. I got down behind this log, and they were screaming, "Let's go, let's go, let's go." And I didn't need to be told. I was just going to, stand up and run away. But see, when I jumped for cover, I went down and forward to reach where the log would hide me. So when I stood up, at that point, that was the closest I was to the object.
How close?
It was still like 8 or 10 feet away, from the surface of it. But that was when the energy discharge happened. I've worked on a number of theories about what might have happened. At the time, some of the other guys on the truck were thinking, immediately Steve said, "It got him." Like, if you shot a deer, you got it,
Right.
And so it might not have been, as we assumed at first, that it was some kind of stun gun or something, but maybe just closing that gap allowed this energy to leap to ground through me. And
Like static electricity or something?
yeah, one thing that really weighs heavy in that direction is they have satellites or something that record the number of lightning strikes. And that area has the highest frequency of lightning strikes of any place in the continental United States, except for the Everglades. The Everglades has a bit more, but that's over water. So that adds to another theory. What were they doing there?
So that area that has a high level of lightning strikes, do you think it makes sense that they're observing that, or is that why they were there? Do you have any thoughts about that?
Up until a few years ago, you walk down the rim road, and if you see a tree that's been hit by lightning, you can always see it. It's a strip of bark that's just blasted out of there, and it's all bare, and it can actually still survive the lightning strike, but it turns the sap to steam instantly, and it just explodes out the side of the tree, blows the bark off. But I was at a conference where this lady was. I said, "What's this?" And she says, "That's fulgurite." I said, "What's that?" And she says, "That's when lightning strikes the earth. You've got millions of volts, millions of degrees that form these crystals that aren't formed geologically." So I kind of leaned towards this theory that perhaps they were looking for fulgurite, for a very unique kind of crystal that would be formed by that kind of blast of energy. I'd never heard of fulgurite before.
Can you pull up an image of that, Jamie? I'd like to see what that looks like. I know tritonite is something that happens when they call it nuclear glass. It happens when there is either a nuclear explosion or when asteroid impacts hit the Earth. That's it right there.
Well, these crystals are supposed to have very special properties for people who are into crystal stuff, but
what does that say there, Jamie? This is what happens. That's what. Wow, that's wild.
it's beautiful, isn't it?
Yeah, it
though?
really is. That's pretty wild. So it might be that they were looking for that. Well,
Could
who
be,
knows? It
could
may be
be.
something that they use for energy. What is that? That's really when lightning struck Santa created that thing? That's wild. That is wild. Look at that. It looks like a tree coming out of the sand.
I'm
That's
guessing
nuts.
that was wet sand.
Yeah.
But
Yeah, well, it's right next to the beach. It must be wet. That is crazy. That's really wild, man. Please tell people your credentials, what your background is.
Sure. So my name is Ryan Graves. I have an engineering degree, mechanical and aerospace engineering. I promptly left doing that to go fly F-18s for the Navy as soon as I graduated college. Did that for about a decade, both operationally in combat as well as an instructor role, teaching the new students. And, we did witness something while we were flying in our jets, but, we were doing it we witnessed it in the context of our just everyday flying in our missions.
And could you describe what was the very first experience?
Yeah, so for me personally, the experience was simply just flying out to the area like I would any other day. And instead of seeing an empty airspace with just my wing person or another squadron doing something in a different block, there were all of a sudden a lot of different radar contacts, which is immediately a problem because, we could be hitting one of those or someone working in our area. And this was happening because we upgraded our radar the best we could tell. And we upgraded to the APG-79, which was a much better radar.
And what is the difference in the capabilities of the upgraded radar system versus the original system?
Mm-hmm. So, kind of practically speaking, it's like going from an analog TV essentially to like an OLED. Just generally speaking, we would expect to see, more objects if there were any out there or smaller objects, but there shouldn't have been any objects out there.
And so how far offshore are you when this is all going down?
Our working areas start about 10 miles off the coast, and then it goes out 100 or 250 miles or so, though we don't usually use those far eastern areas. But we would only see them over the water. So they would really only be in our working areas, maybe slightly in between the working area and land, but never over the land, sometimes over the bays that are in the area that are quite large. But never just kind of zooming west over land or anything like that. We can't necessarily make out the shape or things of that nature. So it's a representation. It's like a block on our screen to show that information. And so when we see that on our radar, we can tell, where it's located, perhaps what's located around it if there's other objects we're detecting, how fast it's going, what direction it's pointed in, what direction it's traveling in. So we call that velocity vector. So if we see this essentially little circle, it'll have a tail coming off of it. And that tail kind of represents the nose of the vehicle, at least as its flight path is going. And so with that, we would typically see an aircraft just kind of trudging along with a straight line, taking occasional turns. But these objects had a little bit more of a, I don't want to say random, but more less controlled flight path. That velocity vector would kind of jump around a bit more. They would not proceed in like a perfectly straight line as you would imagine like a flight navigation computer would take you, right? It takes you from A to B in the straightest line possible. These objects seem to kind of be moving in a direction that was not a straight line, but generally proceeding in that direction. And so they would kind of be meandering slightly, but moving in that general direction, both three-dimensionally and horizontally.
So winding around, going up, going down.
Mm-hmm.
So they're not on a flat plane, and they're not going in a straight line.
So I don't want to draw too many firm statements like that because we would see them being flat, too. We'd see them perfectly stationary up there, regardless of the wind.
Really?
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Wow. So what kind of wind are you talking about?
Oh, gosh. I mean, at altitude, you can have anywhere up to 100, 120 knots of airspeed.
What is that in miles per hour?
It's about 100, 130, 140 miles an hour.
So they're completely stationary with a 140 mile an hour wind.
Correct.
How would something do that?
It's confusing to me as well. Even if we had something that could just burn that much energy, right? Like if you had a sphere surrounded by little rockets, right? Just imagining something right now.
Okay.
And if you wanted to keep that perfectly stationary, right, against gravity, you could just fire all the rockets at the bottom really fast and hopefully keep it flat, right?
Right.
It's going to have tiny little variations. And then if you have wind hitting it and all this, you could potentially have those rockets try to counter it, but it would never be perfectly still in winds like that.
Because the wind's not perfectly still either, right?
Exactly.
It changes and varies.
It does. So it's almost like it's the wind. It's not even really fighting the wind, it seems. It just seems like it's just there in a way.
Wow.
But the way our systems work, when we have all these contacts on our radar, and if we kind of just select one out with our little cursor there, all our sensors go to it. Our FLIR goes to it, which is our camera system. All our weapons, they have like their own little eyes in some sense, and they all look in that direction. And so eventually, someone had one of these selected and flew close enough so that as they look at their FLIR system, their camera, they could see something that was at the spot represented on the radar, right? So there was something there.
So they were seeing it visually with their own eyes?
It didn't look like an object they were seeing on the FLIR. It just looked like a source of IR energy in a sense, almost as if someone was shining a flashlight. But something had to be there to be reflecting that energy or creating it. So at this point, to answer your question, now we're like, okay, this isn't just an error in our radar. This is perhaps, we're thinking this is real. We have to really respect this as like a safety hazard now. Even if it's just a small, however small ribbon of tinfoil, right? Like that suck down the engine can still take out an aircraft, right? So we have to be very respectful of that.
Like a Mylar balloon type thing?
Potentially, right? Yeah.
But how fast are these things going?
So sometimes stationary, right? Sometimes they would be going around 0.6 to 0.8 Mach, which is at altitude about, 240 to maybe 330 knots, around there.
So somewhere in the range of an airplane.
Yeah, a fighter aircraft would be kind of flying around at those airspeeds, except sometimes they would be perfectly stationary as well.
Right. So it's not exhibiting any sort of patterns that you've recognized in the past.
With the stationary, no. With the meandering kind of flight path, no. But I would also see them essentially fly what we call a racetrack pattern. And essentially what that means is they fly in a straight path, and then they do like a 180-degree turn in a certain direction. Then they fly a straight path, then turn again. So that's what we call a racetrack pattern as opposed to a circular holding pattern. We did witness racetrack patterns. In fact, I think there's been some cases off the West Coast just the past couple of weeks where people have also been observing objects flying in racetrack patterns high at altitude with lights. That type of flight path is important because it's a very efficient way to fly, right? If you have to maintain the position in a certain area, you want to minimize how much you're turning. Because anytime you're turning in an aircraft, you're using more energy than if you were just flying straight and level. And so by having a racetrack pattern, it's an efficient way of holding in a position by maximizing straight and level time and minimizing your turn time.
And how long would these things stay up there for?
So from my experience, from our experience, and again, we weren't studying these, but they were always out there. They were
Always.
out there when we took off, we'd see them, and then we go to land, they would still be out there.
Like every day?
Every day.
Every day.
Every
What is the thought? Like, how are you feeling when these, is there an evolution of the thought pattern of how you're addressing these things and thinking about them? Initially, you're thinking they're errors. When do you start getting a thought that, what the fuck is this thing?
Yeah. So that happened when we visually saw one. And the first time we visually saw one, the object was directly at what we call the entry point of the area. So, that box that I told you about in the sky that starts 10 miles off the coast, there's a particular GPS, location and altitude where incoming traffic will fly in and outbound traffic will fly in the exact same spot, but will fly out 1,000 feet lower. There were two aircraft from my squadron, VFA 11, and they flew, took off as a flight of two. That means they're essentially flying in a formation like this. And as they hit the area, one of these objects went right between the aircraft. The lead air crew saw the object. The Dash 2 aircraft crew did not, which is not surprising because they're usually, you're very focused on flying formation. You're just staring right at that aircraft. The lead really has actual leeway to look around. So he saw it, and, he immediately came back. I have to assume he didn't have it on his radar because he wouldn't have flown through this object at the entrance point. He turned around, flew back, landed, and I was in the ready room when he come back, and he had all his gear on, which typically is not a good thing because you want to get that stuff off as fast as possible. So usually means there's a problem of some nature, and he was just sitting there saying, "Hey, I almost hit one of those damn things." And we all knew what he was referring to, even though we didn't necessarily have a name for it, just because we were seeing these so much. And he described it. He described it just as a black or dark gray cube, and that cube was inside of a clear or translucent sphere. And essentially, the apex or the corners of that cube, best he could tell, were touching that inside of that sphere.
And that description mirrors many of the descriptions that people have had of these, whatever you want to call them. Whether they're calling them UAPs now for some strange reason. UFOs is I don't know, does it have a dirty connotation to it? And is it tainted because of so many crazy people talk about UFOs? Is that what it is?
It does come with a lot of assumptions baked in.
It baked in. That's, yeah.
So this is my kind of conspiracy detection kit. The grander the conspiracy theory, the less likely it is to be true. Like, say, Volkswagen cheating the emission standards in Europe. That's a very specific conspiracy theory. Turned out to be true. They really did do that, and for obvious reasons, profit motive, right? But so if you scale up from that, they're trying to control the entire European economy or something like. Well, no, that's too big.
That's just trying to make money.
They're just trying to make money, right? So, the more people that have to be involved, the more elements that have to come. People are incompetent. People can't keep their mouth shut.
For the most part.
For the most part, yes. Now, to be fair to the other side, if you read about the development of the U-2 spy plane and the AR-71 Blackbird, this was done in Burbank, where you used to live. And that's right in the heart of L.A. How did they do this for all those years and nobody knew about it, right?
Well, they were acting on the interests of the government. They were trying to be patriots. They kept their mouth shut because they were trying to win a war against the evil others.
Right. So, again, like with the recent UAP sightings, what I want, my initial response is the SR-71 Blackbird was, before it was declassified, there were commercial pilots going, oh my God, there's something going 3,000 miles an hour, 50,000 feet above me at 30,000 feet. This is impossible. We don't have anything like that. Well, actually, we did have something like that.
Yeah.
So I suspect that
that's what you think the
some
UAPs
of these UAP,
are?
I think in a decade or two, we're going to find out, we had these incredible drones that could fly at these speeds. And
I tend to lean towards that as well sometimes. I go back and forth with it. I had Ryan Graves on recently.
I saw that.
It was a fascinating conversation because the way he was describing things with no visible means of propulsion, no technology that we currently know is available could act in the way those things were acting.
Another problem with these videos is that they're very grainy, blurry. You can't quite make out what's going on. Like the one that it looks like it goes in the ocean, comes back out. It's not clear that it goes in the ocean because the horizon in the ocean is so blurry, right? So I'm a member of this Galileo project at Harvard, run by Avi Loeb, the head of the astronomy department.
I had Avi on.
Yep, I know.
Yeah.
And he's raising money to put cameras, high resolution cameras, all over the world, particularly in the places where people like Graves say when Graves told you, we saw these things every day. It's like every day.
Yeah.
There surely must be high resolution photos of these things.
But those jets are not designed to take high resolution video. They're designed to fight against enemy jets.
Right.
That's what they're designed for. They're designed to recognize these enemy combatants and engage with them in the most effective way possible. That's not with high resolution digital video.
Right. Well, that would be the solution. We just need better data, right?
Well, I wonder if they want better data. Now, let's assume
we do.
The government, but listen, the federal government.
Yeah,
imagine they are running top secret programs using advanced drones and a technology that we're not currently aware of, right? And that the United States government has these. They wouldn't want people taking videos of these things. Why would they?
Right, but everyone has one of these in their pocket.
But you
why
can't
don't we
get
have
digital video of something that's 7 miles away moving at the speed of sound.
Well,
you're not going to get digital video.
That's
of that.
what we want to do with the Galileo project. Is
and
get
according
those cameras
to
up there.
Christopher Mellon, a guy who did work for the Defense Department, he said there are top secret videos and photographs that he's seen or that he's aware of that are pretty spectacular that they don't understand.
Right, I've heard him say that. It's like, okay, then let's see them. Well,
but why would they release that? This is the question: is like if they, just like the Blackbird, just like the stealth bomber, many of the other projects that they have that were top secret before they became public, why would they release all that information?
Probably wouldn't. Right.
Yeah.
Right.
I wonder what that stuff is. And the fact that it happens so often in that very specific area, who knows?
Another thing I was thinking about with the UAPs is in the history of technology, no nation gets very far ahead of any other nation.
Right.
They either back engineer it or copy it or steal the secrets and so on. It's not likely we would have anything that the Russians and Chinese wouldn't be pretty close to having also. Just think of just the development of jets.
Or the development of the nuclear bomb.
The nuclear bomb. I mean, the Russians had, so 1945 was Hiroshima, and 1949 the Russians, they stole our secrets, right? So